Hey there, and welcome. Tonight, we're stepping into a darker corner of history, the harsh, risky, and far less glamorous world of medieval assassins. These weren't the sleek, mysterious figures Hollywood loves to show. They were desperate, hidden in the shadows, changing history with a blade and a whisper. But before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy thoughtful journeys into the past. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always a quiet joy to see how far this little circle of curious minds reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on a fan or let some evening air in. Let's settle in and begin. The medieval sunrise. The world was still asleep when the first breath of dawn touched the crooked rooftops of the village. A pale mist curled through the narrow alleys, wrapping itself around wooden beams and shuttered windows, as if the night did not want to let go. The air was cold, crisp with the quiet of a time long past, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. In a small stone house at the edge of the town, nestled between a bakery and a goat stable, the blacksmith slept beneath a woolen blanket patched by years and weather. His breathing was slow, steady, dreamless. But the light was changing. A timid ray of sunlight slid across the floorboards, climbing carefully toward the cot. Morning was no longer a promise. It had arrived. Outside, the village stirred. A rooster called out, not boldly, but as if it too was tired from yesterday's labor. A cart creaked on the far road, the sound of wooden wheels whispering over frost-bitten ground. The church bell, dulled by distance, chimed once, a soft reminder of time's gentle march. The forge was still dark, its coals cold, but it waited. The tools hung like sleeping soldiers on their hooks, patient and loyal. The anvil sat in silence, untouched, since the last echo of steel on steel had faded the night before. And in that slow, reluctant dawn, as the world held its breath, the blacksmith turned beneath his blanket. Another day awaited him, the kind of day that didn't begin with thunder, but with quiet, the kind of day that demanded strength and offered, in return, nothing but survival. And yet, it would begin, like every day before, with the sun. The blacksmith awakens. The warmth of the blanket had faded, not because the night had taken it, but because morning had fully arrived, slipping into the corners of the small stone house like a guest who did not knock. The blacksmith stirred, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the heaviness of someone who had carried yesterday in his bones. His name was Thomas, though few used it. In the village, he was simply the smith, a man with calloused hands and soot-darkened hair, known more for the sound of his hammer than the shape of his smile. He had lived in that house for 15 winters, and none of them had been kind. But the routine was his shelter, and routine was stronger than grief, than cold, than time itself. He sat up slowly, as if rising too quickly might wake something fragile. His breath clouded in the air, proof that the fire had long gone out. He rubbed his face with rough palms, his skin worn by years of heat and iron. Outside, A distant murmur of village life had begun. Soft voices, a bucket lowering into a well, a child laughing in the frost. But here, in his little room above the forge, it was still quiet enough to hear the creak of wood and the crack of his own neck as he moved. Beside his cot stood a table with a cracked ceramic basin. He poured in a little water from a jug and dipped his hands. The water was bitterly cold. He did not wince. He had long stopped reacting to discomfort. A cloth hung nearby, clean enough. He wiped his face and ran a hand through his thick, unruly hair. Not vanity, just preparation. The day did not allow for anything less. He pulled on his linen shirt, rough against the skin, but familiar. Then the wool trousers worn at the knees. Each movement was measured, unhurried. He had learned that nothing good came from rushing, especially not in his line of work. From beneath the cot, he drew a pair of leather boots, cracked, with soles repaired more times than he could count. He laced them slowly as the light grew stronger, pushing shadows back to their corners. He stood, not tall, not proud, just solid. A man made of flesh, but shaped by iron. Downstairs, the forge awaited. The anvil would be cold, the bellows still, the coals sleeping, but they would wake, just as he had, slowly, silently. He took one last glance out the small window. The village was covered in frost, glittering like it was wrapped in powdered glass. Beautiful, in a way no one spoke of. Beautiful and cold. Thomas placed a hand on the old wooden banister and descended the stairs, one step at a time, into the darkness below. The day had begun, not with joy, not with song, but with purpose. A simple breakfast by candlelight. The forge was still asleep. Tom stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment longer than necessary, letting the chill of the stone floor sink into his bones. The scent of ash lingered in the air, not sharp, but old, settled into the grain of the walls like a memory. It was quiet, almost reverent. The coals in the hearth had not been lit since the night before. No smoke curled from the chimney. No flames danced behind the iron grate. But before the forge could awaken, he needed food. Not a feast, just enough to remind his body it was alive. He moved through the small space with careful hands, touching what needed to be touched, ignoring what didn't. The table was old and uneven, scarred from years of elbows, plates, and tools mistakenly laid down. On it sat a stub of a candle in a dish blackened by soot. He struck flint to steel, once, twice, until a spark caught and a tiny flame flickered to life. The room changed with the light. Shadows shifted, pulling back just enough to reveal the familiar. A crust of bread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, slightly cracked, a brown ceramic cup, chipped at the rim, and beside it, a small clay jug half filled with yesterday's water. He sat slowly, the chair creaking beneath him like an old friend sighing in protest. The bread was dense and stale, but he broke it in his hands with practiced ease. He dipped a piece into the water first, not for flavor, but softness, then brought it to his mouth. His jaw worked silently. No need for hurry, no reason for speech. This was breakfast, plain, honest, undemanding. Outside the window, the morning thickened. The frost had not yet melted, and a pale fog clung low to the streets like a second ground. A dog barked once in the distance. Somewhere, a door slammed, but none of it reached him, not really. The candle flickered in rhythm with his breath, casting gentle light over the worn tabletop and his weathered hands. He poured water into the cup, careful not to spill. It was cold, of course. Everything in winter was. He drank slowly, letting it rest on his tongue before swallowing. There was no sweetness, no warmth, only the taste of stone and time. The cheese was brittle, but sharp. He cut a small piece and let it sit on his tongue, eyes half closed as he chewed. There was something comforting in the ritual of it. Not pleasure, but predictability. The same breakfast, every day. Bread, cheese, water, and sometimes, if he was lucky, a boiled egg from the widow on the corner. Not today. On the far wall, his tools hung in rows. Not decorative, but precise. Hammers, tongs, punches, files. Each with a story, each with a scar. His gaze drifted across them, not with pride, but with familiarity. These were his companions. He trusted them more than he trusted most men. He took another bite. The candle sputtered, and for a moment, in the silence, he let himself remember. There had been mornings when another chair had sat across from him, when footsteps above had meant something lighter, when bread had been warm and laughter, soft and rare, had filled this same room like smoke. But those days had gone with the last war, or maybe the one before that. It no longer mattered which. He blinked once, slowly, not to push the memories away, but to let them drift, like snow melting on a warm surface. Here for a moment, and then gone. He finished the last bite of bread and pushed the plate away. There was no need to clean up just yet. He would be back here again before sunset. The table would wait, like it always did. He stood, the wooden legs of the chair scraping softly against the floor. He pinched out the candle with fingers calloused thick as leather. The room darkened once more, left only with the faintest light from outside. Thomas placed a hand on the doorframe. A breath in. The forge was still cold, but it would not be for long. Outside, the village moved gently toward its day. But here, in the quiet half-light of a blacksmith's home, something had already begun. Slowly, softly, like the warm pull of memory, or the sound of an old song forgotten in the back of the mind. A simple breakfast, a simple morning, but enough. Lighting the fire, the forge waited in darkness. Even now, as morning stretched its fingers across rooftops and into alleyways, the forge remained still. A cavern of shadow and silence beneath the stone cottage. The anvil stood where it always had, unmoving and eternal, its surface dark with ash and time. The bellows hung limp, like lungs that had forgotten to breathe, and the hearth, deep and black, was cold. Thomas stood before it, unmoving. The air was sharper down here, heavy with last night's soot and the breath of coal long since gone cold. He knew this silence. He had lived with it for years, and yet, each morning, it greeted him like something new. not unwelcome, but sacred. This moment before the fire came to life. This pause between what had been and what would be. He knelt slowly, joints stiff but obedient, and reached for the kindling. Thin strips of pine, dry and splintered, tucked neatly into a wicker basket beside the hearth. He laid them in a crisscross pattern, slow and deliberate, as though arranging something fragile. Then came the twigs, then the larger slivers of oak, and finally the coal, rough, dense, and black as night. He struck the flint against the steel. Once, twice, a third time. Sparks danced like fireflies before fading into the dark. On the fourth strike, one caught, licking at the edge of a pine curl. It flickered, fought, and then bloomed into flame. Tomas didn't move. He watched. The fire grew slowly, eating through the kindling with gentle hunger. The flame was not loud, not yet. It whispered, a dry, papery sound, as it spread from one twig to another, from dry wood to damp edge, from silence to song. Shadows on the wall trembled as the light deepened. He reached for the bellows. The leather creaked as he lifted the handles, guiding them open. He pressed down with care, feeding breath into the embers. The fire responded with a glow, a soft growl of heat, like an animal beginning to wake, again and again. The forge was alive now. He stood back, letting the warmth reach his hands. The ache in his fingers softened. His breath no longer clouded. The room began to change. The stones glowing faintly orange. The smell of smoke curling around him like an old coat. The fire had returned, as it always did, because he called it, because it answered. There was no magic in it, only repetition, devotion. He moved to the wall and selected a small hammer, worn smooth from years of use. His fingers wrapped around the handle like they belonged there. He didn't look down. He didn't need to. Every tool had its place. Every movement had been made 1,000 times before. From a corner shelf, he fetched the iron. A dull rod, cold and lifeless. It would change soon. It always did. He placed it beside the fire, just close enough to warm. Not yet in the heart. That came later. For now, it waited, as he had waited. The forge was patient. It required rhythm, timing, respect. He turned back to the flame. It crackled now, steady and sure. It lit the forge in amber tones, painting the anvil in long shadows. Dust hung in the air, like stars in smoke. There was no rush, no noise from the village, only this place, this moment, and the soft, persistent breath of fire. He sat on a wooden stool by the wall, old, slightly crooked, and exactly where he left it every night. From here, he could see the whole room. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, palms warmed by the growing heat. It was strange, in a way, to spend one's life coaxing warmth from stone, only to spend so much of it in silence and cold. But the fire had never lied to him. It didn't flatter. It didn't betray. It either burned or it didn't. And when it failed, it was always his doing. The warmth grew stronger. He could feel it in his chest now, not just his hands. The stiffness in his legs eased. The quiet became comfort, not emptiness. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting his mind drift. He thought of nothing in particular. Not the broken plow he would repair later. Not the traveler who'd asked for new horseshoes. Not the rent due in 2 weeks. Just the fire. Just the rhythm. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to leave this place. To walk away from the forge, the village, the endless days that repeated themselves like verses in an old hymn. But then he opened his eyes, and the fire greeted him, familiar and bright, and he remembered why he stayed. Because here, he knew who he was. Because here, the world made sense. He rose from the stool and approached the hearth again. The iron rod glowed at the edges now, warming slowly. Still not ready. But soon. He adjusted the coals with a pair of long tongs, shifting them with care, opening a pocket of heat beneath the surface. The flames leapt higher, eager for purpose. He fed them a few more slivers of wood, not because they needed it, but because it felt right. The anvil stood ready. The tools were waiting, the fire was strong, and Thomas, blacksmith of a village few would ever name on a map, stood at the center of it all, not as a hero, not as a figure in a story, but simply as a man who lit the fire each morning and watched it come to life. The anvil and the hammer. The anvil was older than Tomas. It had stood in that forge long before he first arrived as a boy, with wide eyes and trembling hands. It was not beautiful, not polished or proud. It bore scars, deep, jagged marks, where mistakes had been struck into its flesh. It was heavy beyond reason, unmoving even during the worst winters, when everything else in the world seemed to shift and collapse. To Tomas, it had always been there, like a silent guardian, like truth. He approached it now, his boots scuffing across the dusty floor, the rising heat from the forge warming his chest and cheeks. His hammer rested in his right hand, its wooden handle worn smooth, the metal head dulled by thousands of blows. It fit his grip like it had grown there. The iron rod from earlier now glowed a soft orange, not yet white hot. That would come, but enough to shape. He reached for it with long iron tongs, lifting it from the heart of the fire. The metal hissed gently as it met the cooler air. He laid it on the anvil. The clang that followed was not sharp or violent, but rhythmic, full. It echoed up the walls, into the beams above, vibrating through the stone floor. Thomas raised his hammer and struck. 1, 2, 3. He turned the rod slightly with the tongs, adjusted, struck again. It was music. A quiet, purposeful melody made only of metal and motion. Each impact was a breath. Each sound, a heartbeat. The hammer rose and fell with practiced grace, not with anger, but with knowledge, with care. Outside, the village continued in its quiet way. Women drawing water, merchants setting up stalls, children laughing in alleyways. But none of that reached this space. The forge was a world apart, enclosed in heat and sound and repetition. Here, there were no arguments, no debts, no lies, only truth, found at the edge of iron. Tomas bent slightly, examining the curve of the metal as it began to change. A slight bend, a taper forming, Not enough. He returned it to the coals, watching as the glow dimmed. It needed more heat, more patience. He stepped back, the hammer still in his hand. His knuckles were thick, scarred, but steady. No tremble, no hesitation. He remembered when there had been. Long ago, on his first day, he had dropped the hammer. His master, a quiet man with a voice like gravel and hands like oak, had said nothing, only picked it up, placed it in Thomas's hand again, and said, "The anvil doesn't judge, it only answers." He never forgot that. The coals flared as he pressed the bellows once more. Fire bloomed. Shadow shifted again on the wall. He held the iron in place, turning it gently, letting the heat spread evenly through its core. It would not do to strike too soon. You had to listen to the metal. You had to know when it was ready, and if you did, it would tell you. When it glowed white, like the belly of the sun, he lifted it again, placed it back onto the anvil, and struck. Sparks leapt, bright against the dark. They danced around him like stars falling sideways. Some landed on his sleeves, others scattered across the floor. He ignored them all. The blows came in pairs now, a rhythm, then a pause, then again. He turned the piece slowly. It had begun to resemble something new. Not just a rod, but a hinge. A piece of a gate, perhaps, or a bracket. He didn't need to know. He only needed to shape it. Outside the forge, time passed unnoticed. In here, the only clock was heat. The only calendar was work. Sweat beaded on his brow and rolled down his temple. He didn't wipe it. He barely felt it. His world narrowed to the sound of hammer on iron, the slight give of hot metal, and the weight of memory that lived in the swing of his arm. He thought, briefly, of his father. A cobbler, not a smith. Gentle hands, soft eyes. He had not understood Thomas's draw to flame and noise and weight, but he hadn't tried to stop it either. He had simply said, "If it brings you peace, let it shape you." It had. The anvil rang out again. He smiled, just barely, at the sound. There was no music in the world like it, no sound more certain. The anvil never lied. It only spoke what was true. The metal is ready, or it is not. You are sure, or you are not. After a final blow, Thomas held the piece up to the light. It shimmered, its shape clean, the edges strong. Not perfect. Nothing ever was, but close. Close enough to serve. He quenched it in water. The hiss loud, sudden. Steam rose in a quiet gasp. He set the piece aside, onto the cooling rack, where it would rest among others. Anonymous, humble, finished. He stood straight, rolling his shoulder. The hammer hung in his hand, heavy but familiar. He placed it gently on the workbench. Its job done for now. Not over. Just paused. The forge still glowed. The fire still breathed. Tom stepped back and looked at the anvil once more. It stood as it always had. Patient, honest, waiting. He would return to it again and again. He always did. Because in a world full of things he could not fix, failing crops, lost friends, broken trust, the anvil offered something rare. A place where things could be made whole again, one strike at a time, the heat of the forge. By mid-morning, the forge was breathing. The fire had grown from a flicker to a fury, not wild or uncontrolled, but steady, alive in its own deliberate rhythm. Its glow filled the room with deep amber light, casting shifting patterns across stone walls and the thick wooden beams overhead. Heat rolled in waves from the hearth, pulsing like the slow, strong heartbeat of the building itself. Tom stood in the center of it all, arms bare now, sleeves rolled past his elbows, the skin of his forearms slick with sweat and dotted with the faint memory of old burns. His shirt clung to his back. Every inch of him felt wrapped in warmth, the kind that wasn't gentle, but demanding, the kind that pressed against your chest and asked you to prove yourself again and again. The forge was no place for the weak. It asked much, but it gave in return heat, light, and the ability to shape the world. He moved through it with practiced ease, his body used to the weight of it all. The tongs in his left hand, the hammer in his right, every motion measured, every step certain. The fire might roar and the sweat might pour, but Tomas never rushed. To hurry in the forge was to invite danger, and he had known enough of that already. The walls of the smithy were blackened from years of flame. The smell of hot iron clung to the stones like perfume, sharp, rich, unmistakable. Even the dust in the air was warm, motes of soot drifting like fireflies in the light. From time to time, he would step back, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. The heat never stopped, not even for a breath. It found its way into everything, into the wood of the bench, into the grain of the hammer handle, into the soles of his boots. It even lived in the silence, humming beneath every sound. And yet, there was peace in it. A strange, gritty peace. Because here, inside the belly of the forge, Thomas was not thinking about what he had lost, or what the world outside expected of him. He wasn't wondering if there would be enough bread this week, or whether the winter would take another of the older folk before the snow melted. Here, there was only the metal, the fire, and the feel of his own breath, steady and slow. He placed another rod into the heart of the flame. Not too fast. It had to warm evenly. He watched the color of the metal change, shifting from dull gray to red, then to a glowing orange. A dance of transformation. He never tired of it. After all these years, it still held something sacred. He had never been to a church more than he had to, but he imagined this place, the forge, was close to prayer. It had its rituals, its silence, its heat, and its judgment. And most of all, it had its honesty. Iron never lied. He pulled the rod from the coals and laid it on the anvil, striking it with quick, clean blows. Sparks burst around him again, hissing as they disappeared into nothing. The heat rose around his face, wrapping him like a thick, invisible cloak. It would exhaust him by evening. It always did. His shoulders would ache. His hands would tremble when no one could see. And yet, he came back each day. He endured the weight of it. Because shaping metal was simpler than shaping life. It didn't ask for love. It didn't break your heart. It only asked for strength and gave something useful in return. The piece was shaping well, a hinge, perhaps, or a gate bracket. It didn't matter what it became. What mattered was that it was being made. A bead of sweat ran from his temple to his jaw. He didn't notice. He struck again, and again. The forge had no windows, just two high vents for smoke. Still, light found its way in, slipping through the cracks in the stone, mingling with the red-orange glow of the fire, until the whole place looked like a cave lit from within. Thomas remembered once, as a child, hearing a tale of dragons, great winged beasts that lived in the mountains, guarding gold and breathing flame. He had believed it, not because he'd seen one, but because the idea of something alive inside fire had felt true. It still did. And if such a creature existed, he was sure it would have lived in a place like this, glowing with heat, forged in purpose. He smiled faintly at the memory as he turned the metal and struck again. No dragons here. Just one man. One anvil. One hammer. And the fire, the longer he worked, the more he melted into it. Not into the fire itself, but into the rhythm of it. The breath and strike, the pull and bend, the quench and cool. He didn't think anymore. He simply moved. At one point, he stopped to sip water from a tin cup, the only cool thing in the room. He sat for a moment on the old stool, feeling the warmth in his chest, his limbs, his bones, and he didn't resist it. He let it settle into him. The forge wasn't just something he worked in. It was something he carried with him. Every burn, every callus, every ache in his back, proof that he belonged here. He returned to the anvil. Another piece. Another strike. The heat pressed in from every direction, but he did not falter. Because in the forge, he was not just surviving, he was making something that would last. The apprentice's first days. He arrived just after the last of the harvest wagons had rolled through the village, when the air was already heavy with smoke from distant fires and the promise of winter curled in every gust of wind. And he looked small, younger than 16, though he said he was 17. His boots were too large and his hands were too clean. And when he knocked on the forge door that first morning, Tomas had not been expecting anyone, certainly not a boy with a threadbare satchel and a stubborn tilt to his chin. The boy's name was Elias, and he introduced himself with a kind of quiet urgency, not desperate, but determined, the way someone speaks when they have burned bridges behind them and refuse to look back. He said he wanted to learn, not just the trade, but the rhythm, the skill, the life. Tomas said nothing at first. He looked him over, not cruelly, but carefully, as though measuring the boy in the same way he'd measure a raw piece of iron, wondering if it would bend or break in fire. And then, without a word, he turned back into the forge and left the door open behind him. That was how it began. The first days were quiet. Thomas didn't ask questions, and Elias didn't offer answers. He swept the floor with nervous care, as if unsure how much pressure a broom required. He fetched coal, water, oil, cloth, never needing to be told twice, never asking what it was for. He observed everything. The way Thomas struck the metal, the way he moved the rod through the flame, the way he adjusted the bellows with a rhythm that seemed to come from within his bones. Elias watched, without staring. He listened without interrupting, and when Tomas finally handed him a pair of heavy iron tongs and told him to hang them back on the wall, he did so with both hands, holding them like a sacred object, not a tool. He moved awkwardly at first, shoulders hunched, steps too quick, as if afraid of being in the way. But Tomas said nothing. He let the boy settle. He let the forge do the teaching. By the third morning, Elias was there before the sun rose. He was already stacking wood when Tomas came down the stairs, the smell of smoke barely in the air. His breath clouded around his face in the cold, his fingers red with chill, but never still. That was the morning Tomas let him light the fire. It took 4 tries. The first spark danced and vanished in the ash. The second missed the kindling entirely. The third flared for a heartbeat and died, but the fourth caught, and the flame rose with a flicker of stubborn life, slow at first, then stronger, and Elias didn't smile, didn't speak, just sat back on his heels and watched it grow, as if he couldn't quite believe something had listened to him. Thomas watched him from the corner, and though he said nothing, something in his chest shifted. The forge accepted people slowly. It was a place of heat, of weight, of noise and silence in equal measure. You couldn't force your way in. You had to listen. You had to move with it. Elias learned that. He learned not to ask what something was for, but to observe how it was used. He learned to hand Tomas the right tool without being told. He learned to pull back when the metal was too hot and to step forward just before it cooled. He learned the rhythm, not by being told, but by breathing in time with it. And Tomas, who had once been that same boy, awkward and wide-eyed, saw it happening. Slowly, quietly, like a blade being drawn from the fire. There were mistakes, of course. A dropped tool that nearly cracked the floor. A bar of iron pulled from the coals too soon and ruined. A bucket of water spilled in haste. Tom's never raised his voice. He only nodded once, slowly, and let the boy feel the weight of the error himself. The forge didn't punish. It revealed. If you rushed, it showed you. If you hesitated, it showed you. And if you tried again with more care, more thought, more trust in your own hands, it welcomed you back without a word. They didn't talk much during those first days, but when they did, it was about things that mattered. The way the coal should sound when it was right, how the metal changes color when it's nearly ready, why the hammer doesn't always need to strike hard to be true. They spoke in fragments, in murmurs, over the hiss of steam and the hum of fire. And between those words, trust grew. Not quickly, but steadily, like everything in the forge. One evening, after the fire had been quenched and the tools hung back on the wall, Thomas caught Elias staring at the anvil. The boy stood still, eyes fixed on the deep scars etched into its surface, the marks of years, of failures, of strength. He asked quietly, "Do they ever go away?" Tomas didn't answer right away. He walked to the anvil, ran a hand over its cold face, then said softly, "No. They stay, so you remember." Elias nodded. He didn't ask anything more. By the end of the week, Toms no longer checked the fire every morning. Elias lit it before he came down. It was never perfect, but it was getting close, and that was enough. In the world outside, people came and went. Fields were plowed, markets opened. The wind turned colder each day. But inside the forge, something slower was being shaped. Not a tool, not a blade. A person, a rhythm, a bond. Elias was not yet a smith, not even close. But he was no longer just a boy with a satchel and silent fear. He was becoming part of the fire, customers of the smith. They came at all hours, some early, just as the sun lifted the mist off the cobblestones, their cloaks still damp with morning dew. Others late, long after the village square had emptied and the stalls had been packed away, their voices low, their business quiet. They came with broken things, rusted things, warped things, with tools split at the seam, hinges that no longer held, blades chipped from battle or foolishness or time. And always, they came with stories. Stories they didn't always tell, but which lived in the weight of the objects they carried. The farmer came first, always the same man, thick arms and thick boots, smelling of earth and silence, bringing his plowshare or his shears, worn from honest labor, metal dulled not by war, but by repetition. He never spoke more than necessary. He nodded when Thomas asked, left the coin on the table without counting, and picked up his tools days later, as if he trusted the forge more than he trusted himself. He was simple, not stupid, just steady. And the work he brought was the kind Tomas respected most. Then came the soldiers, not knights. They never bothered with village smiths, but footmen, mercenaries, local guards, men with nicked swords and bent buckles, the scent of iron, not just on their weapons, but on their skin. They came fast, always in a rush, always needing something mended before sunset. Elias watched them with wide eyes. Tomas didn't. He had seen too many of them. Most were gone before the repair cooled. None returned the same. The women came too, not often, but always with care. A panhandle cracked at the rivet, a ladle bent out of shape. Once, a sewing needle that had snapped and could not be replaced. Thomas took their requests with the same weight as a sword. No job was too small. If it mattered to them, it mattered to the forge. Some customers talked. They told stories while Tomas worked, not because he asked, but because the sound of the hammer invited confession. One spoke of a lost brother. Another, a harvest that failed. One woman cried softly while watching her husband's horseshoe be reforged, the only thing left after the accident. Toms never interrupted. He let the hammer speak for him. And when the job was done, they always looked lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because someone had shared in the carrying of it. There were difficult ones too, men who haggled, who insulted the price, the weight, the quiet, who thought a smith was only a tool, not a craftsman. Tomas didn't argue. He simply pointed to the door. The forge didn't welcome every coin. It welcomed respect. Sometimes, the priest came. He didn't bring metal. He brought candles. Old brass holders bent at the base, crosses in need of polish, hinges for the church door. He never spoke of God, only of hinges that groaned in the cold. Thomas did the work for free, not because he believed, but because even silence needs a space to enter. Elias took it all in. Every visitor, every transaction. He noticed how Tomas looked them in the eyes, but not too long. How he listened without promising. How he never guaranteed more than what he could do. When customers thanked him, he nodded. When they didn't, he didn't mind. It wasn't about praise. It was about completion. A broken thing made whole again. That was enough. One afternoon, a young boy arrived, no more than 9. His hand gripped something wrapped in cloth. He stood near the door, shifting from foot to foot. Tomas didn't speak. He waited. The boy stepped forward and unwrapped a twisted latch. "It was my father's," he said, voice shaking just enough to be noticed. "Can you fix it?" Tomas took it without a word. He nodded once. The boy watched for a moment longer, then left without looking back. Tomas placed the latch on the work table, slower than usual. Elias didn't ask. He just stood quietly nearby, the way Tomas had once done for him. The forge didn't choose its customers. It welcomed whoever came through the door, rich or poor, loud or quiet, grateful or angry. All left something behind, a blade, a tool, a story. Tomas didn't keep the stories, but the metal remembered. Sometimes, when night had fallen and the forge had cooled, Tomas would brush his hand across the finished work, not out of pride, but connection. That hinge would swing on a cupboard that held bread. That blade might cut wood for a hearth. That horseshoe would carry someone's future. Nothing left his forge without a part of him in it. Nothing ever truly left at all. And in the midst of it, Elias kept learning how to receive a customer with calm, how to read the quiet between their words, how to shape not just iron, but trust. That was the real lesson. That was what the fire could never teach. Only life. Only time. They came with broken things. They left with something more. And Tomas, without saying it, knew the truth of it all. He wasn't just mending metal. He was mending lives. One hammer blow at a time, shoeing horses in the morning mist. The mist hung low over the village that morning, soft and thick, like breath frozen in time, curling around the rooftops and spilling across the cobbled street in ribbons of silence. And even the birds seemed unwilling to disturb it. The forge door stood slightly open, not from haste, but from habit, as Thomas moved through the back lot behind the building where the ground turned from stone to dirt, and the air carried a faint scent of damp hay and waiting animals. Elias was already there, standing with arms folded, trying to look calm, though his breath came in little white clouds, his eyes fixed on the old brown horse tethered near the fence. She was patient, gentle, in the way only older animals could be, eyes heavy-lidded, hooves steady, as if she too had known long days and longer nights. The man who brought her, a farmer with sun-dried skin and a limp that told a story he didn't, said little, just pointed to the rear hoof and muttered something about loose iron. Tomas nodded, knelt, ran a hand along the leg, and murmured words only the horse could hear. She didn't flinch. She knew this place. She knew this man. There was something sacred in that stillness, in the moment before touch, before the work began, when trust passed, like a breath, between man and beast. The tools lay ready in a shallow wooden box: rasp, nails, pincers, the fresh shoe still cool from the rack where it had waited overnight. Thomas didn't speak as he picked them up. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. He lifted the hoof gently, resting it against his thigh, the horse shifting her weight without resistance, as though offering her burden like an old friend. The iron was indeed loose. Edges flared slightly. One nail bent, another missing entirely. He removed the old shoe with care, easing the nails free with quiet patience, letting each one drop into the dirt with a muted sound. The fog moved slowly around them, thick enough to hide the far trees, soft enough to make every movement feel farther away than it was. Elias stood watching, arms still folded, but his eyes moved constantly, following every step, every gesture, the way Tomas never forced, never pulled too hard, never rushed. Shoeing a horse wasn't about strength. It was about rhythm, balance, listening. With the old shoe removed, Thomas inspected the hoof, scraping gently with the knife, smoothing the surface, trimming where needed. The sound of metal on horn was quiet, almost soothing, like a whisper between old companions. When he finished, he held the new shoe to the firebox just inside the doorway, warming it slightly. Not enough to burn, just enough to soften the shock of cold iron against warm flesh. He pressed the shoe in place, not hard, just firm. The steam rose instantly, a sharp hiss, the smell of burnt keratin floating into the fog. The horse didn't move. She barely blinked. Tomas nailed the shoe in place quickly, cleanly, each strike deliberate, the nails curling out the side as they should. He clipped them, rasped the edges smooth, checked the balance. Then he lowered the hoof, patted her flank, and stepped back. Done. Elias exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. The farmer nodded his approval, handed over a coin, scratched the horse's neck, and led her away into the mist without a word. Her hooves clopped lightly on the dirt, fading into silence. Tomas watched them go, not because he needed to, but because he always did. They worked on 2 more horses that morning, a young gray gelding, restless and uncertain, and a black mare with a scar along her chest and eyes that missed nothing. Each one different. Each one needing patience. The forge was not just for fire and steel. It was for this, too. For the living weight of creatures who trusted without asking, who stood still and allowed themselves to be held, shod, released. When the last horse had gone and the mist had begun to lift, Tomas sat on the bench outside the forge, elbows on his knees, the tools beside him in the dirt. Elias sat too, though not too close, hands finally unclenched. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need. The work had been done. The day had begun. The world, still wrapped in cloud, moved slowly around them. Finally, Elias said, "They don't mind the fire?" Thomas looked at him, then shook his head. "They mind fear more. If your hands are calm, the heat doesn't scare them." Elias nodded, as if tucking the words into a drawer in his mind, one of many he'd opened since coming here. Then he added, more quietly, "I'd like to try, one day." Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the sky, pale and soft above the trees, then turned back and said, "You will. when the horse is ready, and when you are. The fog continued to retreat, pulling back toward the hills, revealing rooftops, trees, the church spire in the distance. The village stretched itself awake, but at the forge, time still held its breath, wrapped in the lingering smell of horse and iron and smoke. Shoeing a horse wasn't just a task, it was a ritual. A meeting between muscle and metal, between trust and weight. And like everything in the forge, it required more than strength. It required care. Thomas stood, brushed off his hands, picked up the tools, and returned them to their box. Elias rose too, following, quieter now, but more sure. They stepped back inside. The mist behind them drifted on, a broken spearhead. It arrived wrapped in burlap, the kind of cloth usually used to carry grain or firewood. Rough and stained and knotted at both ends, as if the contents inside were still dangerous, still sharp, still able to wound, even though the shape beneath it had clearly lost whatever edge it once had. The man who brought it wasn't local. That much was obvious. His boots were too clean, his coat too stiff, his voice too clipped. He didn't introduce himself. He just set the bundle down on the edge of the work table and said, "Can you fix this?" Tomas didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag, untied the knots carefully, and opened the burlap. Inside lay what was left of a spearhead. Thick iron, cracked down the middle. The tip snapped clean off. The shaft long gone. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't ceremonial. This had been used, not once or twice, but often. The break was clean, recent. A fight maybe, or worse. Tomas ran his fingers along the edge. The metal was old, but not brittle. Forged strong, forged well, and broken hard. He looked up at the man, who stood stiffly by the forge door, as if unsure whether he belonged inside. Thomas asked, "You want it repaired?" The man nodded once, slowly. His hands were clasped behind his back, but his knuckles were white. Thomas turned back to the piece, studied the break, the stress lines, the grain of the fracture. It could be reforged, welded together, reshaped, reforged with care. Not perfect, never the same again. But strong, serviceable. He didn't ask why. He never did. The forge wasn't a place for questions. It was a place for answers that came in heat and time and iron. He told the man to return in 2 days. The man nodded again, turned, and left without another word. Elias stood quietly in the corner, near the water barrel, watching. When the door closed, he stepped forward and said, "That wasn't just any spearhead." Toms didn't look at him. He just said, "No, it wasn't." And then he set to work. He began by heating the halves separately, letting the fire crawl deep into the fibers of the metal until it softened enough to reveal its old intentions. Iron remembers, if you treat it right. It tells you what it wants to be. This piece, even in its broken state, still wanted to fight, still wanted to hold fast. He tapped at the edges gently with a thin hammer, clearing burrs, aligning grain, listening for resistance. The fire crackled, the anvil rang, and Elias stood by, holding tools without being told. They worked in silence most of the afternoon, the rhythm of forge life filling the spaces where speech might go. The low hum of the bellows, the hiss of water, the scrape of metal, the breath caught between strikes. Tom shaped a new tip, not an exact copy, but a mirror of what might have been. He joined it to the shaft, welded the brake, reforged the entire head with even strokes. It was slow work, intimate, the kind of work you do not for coin, but for something heavier, something that lives in the hands even after the object is finished. Elias finally spoke again when Thomas quenched the finished shape and set it aside to cool. Was it a soldier's? Tomas didn't answer, not with words. He just looked at the spearhead, steam still rising from its surface, and said quietly, "It belonged to someone who needed it." Elias nodded. That was enough. That night, Tomas didn't go upstairs right away. He sat near the hearth, the forge long since gone cold, the spearhead resting on a folded cloth beside him. He drank a little water, rubbed the soreness from his wrist, and stared at the metal like it might speak. Maybe it already had. There were things metal couldn't hide, angles that told of panic, breaks that told of violence, weight that carried sorrow like a stain. He had seen it all before. In swords, in helmets, in horseshoes that came back bloodied. The next morning, he sanded the edges, polished the surface, sharpened the point. It wasn't new. It wasn't perfect. But it was ready. And when the man returned, he didn't speak at first. He looked at the piece in Tomas's hand, eyes flickering once, just once, as he reached for it. He turned it over, tested the balance, and then nodded. A small gesture, nothing more. Tomas wrapped it again, not in burlap, but in clean cloth. Not because he had to, but because the metal deserved it. The man handed over the coin and said, "Thank you." Not stiff, not clipped, just quiet, real. Then he turned and left, disappearing down the road without looking back. Tomas watched him until he was gone. Elias stood by the window, arms crossed. After a while, he said, "Sometimes the broken ones mean the most." Thomas didn't respond right away. He walked to the water barrel, washed his hands slowly, dried them on the rag, and then said, "Everything breaks eventually. What matters is how you put it back together." And in the silence that followed, Elias understood more than he had the day before, the quiet stench of the forge. It wasn't pleasant, not by any measure of beauty or grace or comfort, but it was constant, reliable, the kind of smell that wrapped itself into the wood, into the stone, into the skin, until it wasn't separate anymore, until it simply was. And that was the stench of the forge. It hung in the air like a coat you never quite took off. Thick with iron, coal, sweat, oil, old leather, singed wood, and something else too, something sour and faintly metallic. A scent that reminded you of blood, even when there wasn't any. Tomas never noticed it anymore. It lived in his beard, in his clothes, in the calluses of his fingers. It was in the grain of the floorboards and the cracks in the anvil, in the ash beneath the work table, and the handle of the hammer. To him, it wasn't offensive. It was simply home. But Elias noticed. He never said so, not aloud, but it showed in the way he wrinkled his nose slightly when he came down the stairs each morning, the way he held his breath just a little when lifting the lid on the coal barrel, the way he washed his hands longer than necessary after putting out the fire. He never complained. He wouldn't, but Thomas knew. He remembered. When he'd first entered a forge as a boy, it had made him gag, not just from the smoke or the heat, but from that thick, clinging scent that settled into the lungs like a second breath. He had hated it, and now he barely knew it was there. Some days, it was stronger than others. After heavy rain, when the damp crept in and loosened the smells trapped in the walls. After working leather, scorched and stretched, its aroma somewhere between burnt meat and old boots. After long hours hammering horseshoes, when the scent of singed hoof drifted up with the steam. Or worse, after an accident, a fingertip burned, a spark caught in a sleeve, the unmistakable smell of skin touched by flame. That was the worst. That never left you, not really. But it wasn't just unpleasant. That was the strange thing. For all its foulness, the stench had comfort in it. 2. It meant the fire had burned. That work had been done. That steel had bent and something had been made. It meant life was continuing, slow and hot and full of purpose. The village smelled of manure and rotting straw and mold, but no one spoke of it. The forge smelled of labor, and no one questioned it. Elias asked once, after a long day, when his arms were sore and his eyes rimmed with soot, "Does it ever stop smelling like this?" Thomas had paused, not out of amusement, but because it was a good question, more honest than most. He answered, "No, but one day you'll miss it when it's gone." Elias had said nothing back, but his face shifted, and he looked at the glowing coals like he was trying to imagine what absence smelled like. The smell crept into everything. Bread brought into the forge tasted faintly of smoke. Water left too long in the room warmed and thickened with the tang of metal. Even sleep carried it. The bed sheets, the pillow, the dreams. Tomas had dreamed of fire long before he became a smith. Now he dreamed of hammers, of sparks, of the strange comfort of the forge's breath curling around him like a lullaby. Visitors noticed it most. They entered with wrinkled noses, a hand half raised to wave away the air, but they never said anything. They understood. You didn't insult the place where things were made. You didn't speak poorly of the fire when you needed it to work for you. The stench was part of the price. Sometimes Thomas thought it was like grief. Not sharp, not loud, not always painful, but constant, familiar, always there beneath the surface. It dulled over time, became manageable, but never vanished. You learned to carry it. You learned to breathe with it. And eventually, you stopped noticing the weight. There were moments, rare and small, when the smell almost disappeared. Right after the forge had been scrubbed, top to bottom, the fire cold, the windows open, the air moving freely. On those days, the place felt hollow, too clean, too empty. The absence of the smell was like silence after music. Strange, unsettling, as if the forge itself was holding its breath. Tomas didn't clean too deeply anymore. There was no point. You couldn't erase years of fire. You couldn't wash away the soul of the work. And he didn't want to. The stench reminded him that things had been built here, fixed here, broken and remade. Elias started to notice that, too. He stopped wrinkling his nose after the second month. He stopped scrubbing his hands raw. He still cleaned the tools with care, still washed his face twice before supper. But the grimace was gone. He breathed through it now, worked through it, became part of it. One day, he came down the stairs before dawn, before Thomas had lit the fire, before the forge had awakened, and he stood in the center of the room and said quietly, "It's different when the fire's out." Thomas looked up from the kindling, paused, then said, "Yes, the smell waits." Elias nodded. Then he bent down, struck the flint, and let the spark fly. That day, the forge breathed again, hot and thick, and full of that quiet, familiar stench. And neither of them noticed it anymore. A bowl of warm soup. It wasn't much, not by any measure of feast or flavor or finery, but it was hot, it was simple, and it was enough, and that alone made it something close to sacred. The bowl sat on the edge of the work table, steam curling softly into the air, rising through the smell of soot and metal and ash, bringing with it something quieter, something softer. Onions, carrots, potatoes, maybe a hint of dried thyme, if Tomas had remembered to add it, or maybe not. Maybe it was just the memory of herbs drifting in from another life. The soup was always thin, never thick enough to coat a spoon. Just broth, a few vegetables, sometimes barley, if coin allowed. Always made in the same black pot that hung from a hook in the back corner of the forge, near the wall where no sparks reached. Tomas sat with his back to the hearth, the heat still warm on one side of his face, the spoon in his hand, worn down at the edges, wood smoothed by time and lips and repetition. He ate slowly, not out of fatigue, though that was there, but because it was the only part of his day that moved without rhythm, without hammer or fire or weight. Just warmth, just breath, just soup. Elias sat across from him, legs drawn up on the bench, his bowl balanced between two hands, like it might escape if he let go. He always ate quickly at first, as if he still half expected someone to take it away, and then, halfway through, slowed down, letting the heat settle into his chest. He never asked where the food came from. He never questioned what was in it. He knew better. In the forge, you didn't waste questions on things that fed you. You simply said thank you, even if you said it with silence. There was a rhythm to it, even here, even at rest. Tomas would finish first, always. He would sip the last of the broth, wipe his mouth with the same square of cloth he used for oil stains, then lean back with a quiet sigh, the kind that came not from age, but from hours. Then Elias would speak, not always, but often. He would say something small, about the way the wind had shifted outside, or the new scuff on the hammer handle, or the color of the flame that morning. Never big things, never deep things. The soup made him thoughtful. The warmth made the words come easier, but still, he held them like stones, one at a time, measured, careful. That day, it was snowing outside, not heavily, just a dusting, enough to soften the rooftops and hush the air. The forge was quiet, no customers, no orders waiting, just the two of them and the soup. Elias said, "It tastes like winter." Tomas looked at him, spoon resting in the bowl, and raised an eyebrow. How does winter taste? Elias shrugged. Like this. Like warm things in cold rooms. Like smoke. Like something missing, but in a good way. Tom's didn't answer right away. He took another sip, let it sit in his mouth. Then he said, "That's not soup. That's memory." Elias smiled, just barely. The bowls were mismatched. One was chipped at the rim. The other had a crack running along the base, sealed long ago with wax and stubbornness. But they held the soup just the same. Tom had found them years back at a trade stall, paid half a coin for both, and never looked for new ones. Things that held warmth were worth keeping, even if they leaked a little. After lunch, they always sat a while longer. Not because there was time, there never really was, but because the body needed stillness, because heat needed to settle, because you didn't jump straight from soup to steel. You had to let the fire in your stomach meet the fire in your hands. Sometimes Thomas would tell stories. Not often, but enough. Stories about old customers, about strange tools, about a traveler who once paid him with a carved whistle and a promise. Elias never interrupted. He just listened, head tilted, spoon resting idle in the bowl, eyes watching Tomas the way one watches a fire just before it dies. Closely, quietly, with something like awe. That day, there were no stories. Only snow. Only soup. Thomas stood first, as always. Collected the bowls, rinsed them with water from the barrel, set them on the high shelf where the heat could dry them. Elias stood too, slower, stretching his legs, brushing crumbs from his trousers, looking toward the door like the world outside might have changed while they rested. It hadn't, but it looked softer, quieter. The kind of world that held its breath while two men sat with soup and nothing else. Thomas turned back to the fire. The coals needed stirring. The metal needed shaping. The day was far from done, but in that small pause, in that quiet moment between hammer strikes and footsteps, a bowl of soup had done what no tool could do. It had reminded them they were human, the silence of the guild hall. The guild hall stood at the end of the cobbled lane, past the market square, past the old well, past the baker's shop where steam curled from windows, even in the deepest winter. And it waited there, silent, tall, unmoved, built of dark timber and stone, its doors thick and iron-bound, never locked, but never quite welcoming either. Thomas hadn't been there in months, maybe more. It wasn't the kind of place you visited without purpose. It didn't call to you. It summoned you. And when it did, you went. Not out of fear, out of tradition, out of respect. Because the forge might shape the metal, but the guild shaped the man. Elias had never been inside. He stood beside Tomas. Now, gloved hands clasped tight, eyes flicking toward the wide oak doors, with a mixture of curiosity and something quieter, something closer to reverence. Tomas didn't speak. He just nodded once and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking not with rust, but with age, as if the very wood remembered every hand that had turned its handle. Inside, it was dim, not dark, just heavy with shadow. The light came through high windows, narrow and dust-streaked, falling in pale stripes across the stone floor. The air smelled of wax and ink and old parchment, of time stretched out over centuries, of voices that no longer echoed but had once spoken here, long ago, about iron and oath and fire. No one raised their voice in the guild hall, not even in anger, especially not in anger. The walls demanded quiet. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was expectation. The floorboards creaked under their boots as they stepped forward, past the long benches, past the low tables stacked with ledgers and scrolls, toward the hearth at the far end, where no fire burned but ash still clung to the grate, a faint ghost of heat long gone. No one greeted them at first, and that too was tradition. You entered, you waited, you were seen, then you were acknowledged, not before. Tomas removed his gloves, folded them, placed them in his belt. Elias followed suit. The gesture mattered. It showed you had nothing to hide in your hands, that you were ready to be measured not by what you held, but by what you had made. They stood there in the quiet, side by side, not speaking. The sound of their breath, the only thing that moved. Finally, a door opened near the back wall. A man stepped out, older than Tama, maybe, or simply aged differently, thinner but not frail. Dressed in plain wool, the badge of the guild, a hammer over flame, stitched on his shoulder in silver thread. He said Tomas's name, not as a question, but as a statement. Tomas nodded once. Then he said, "I've brought my apprentice." The man's eyes moved to Elias, not unkindly, not warmly, just openly. A gaze that weighed without pressing, measured without judgment. Then he turned and said, "Follow me." They did. The inner room was smaller, round, walls lined with tools that had never touched flame. Ceremonial hammers, symbolic tongs, blades forged not for use, but for remembrance. A table stood in the center, low and wide, covered in parchment, ink, a sand-filled hourglass that no one turned. The man sat. Tomas and Elias remained standing. They spoke of names first, of records, of lineage, of who had trained Tomas and who had trained the man before him. The guild was not concerned with fame. It cared for memory, for the thread that tied one hand to the next, across generations, like iron links in an unbreakable chain. Then they spoke of work, not contracts, not coin, but labor, shapes, fires, failures, lessons. Thomas answered simply. He didn't embellish. The forge didn't like boasting, and neither did he. Elias said nothing. He was not asked to. He stood still, absorbing everything. The way the man's voice never rose, the way Tomas kept his hands visible, the way every word felt chosen from a shelf of older words, polished by use and time. After a while, the man stood. He walked to the back wall, took down a small book, leather-bound. He opened it, wrote something inside. Not much. A line, a name, a date. Then he closed it, returned it to the shelf, and nodded once. "Let him learn," he said. "Let the forge teach him. And when it's time, bring him back." That was all. That was everything. They bowed. A shallow bend at the neck, no more. Then they left, boots echoing faintly behind them, the door closing softly, sealing the silence back inside. Outside, the wind had picked up. The village moved again, carts rattling, dogs barking, a bell ringing near the chapel. Life resumed. The guild hall remained behind them, still unshaken. Elias walked quietly for a while. Then he asked, "Did I pass something?" Tomas shook his head. "Not yet," he said, "but you were seen, and that's the first step." They said nothing more. But when they returned to the forge, Elias lit the fire without being told, and Tomas let him. The other smith across the way. He worked just 3 doors down, tucked behind a crooked stone arch where ivy grew even in winter, where the windows stayed shuttered until noon, and smoke drifted from the chimney in slow, tired coils, and his name was Garin, though most people didn't say it, didn't need to, because in a village this small, you didn't need to name someone you already saw every day. He had been there longer than Elias had been alive, longer than Tomas Ujra had worked his own forge. And some said he had learned his craft in the city. Others said he had never left the village. But either way, his hands knew iron, and that was enough to make him matter. Tomas didn't dislike him. That would have taken effort. He simply acknowledged him, as one might acknowledge an old tree at the edge of a field, always there, silent, unmoving, useful, but not a part of your day. They rarely spoke, not from bitterness, from knowing. Blacksmiths did not often talk to each other unless they had to. Too much shared noise, too much overlap. It was like hearing your own hammer in someone else's rhythm. Not wrong, just uncomfortable. Garen's forge was smaller, darker, lined with old stones and walls that leaned ever so slightly, as if the building itself was tired of standing. But people went to him. Not many, not often, but some. And that was enough. Sometimes, a villager would walk past Tomas's door, head down, a broken blade wrapped in cloth, and keep walking. Sometimes, Tomas would see the glow from Garen's forge late at night, well after most had gone to bed, and hear the distant ring of metal, softened by walls and memory. He didn't resent it, not really. It was the way of things. 2 fires burning, 2 anvils ringing, 2 men doing the same work with different hands. Elias noticed him first. Of course he did. New eyes always saw what old ones had learned to ignore. He asked one morning, as they sanded a hinge, "Why don't you talk to him?" Thomas didn't look up, just said, "Because we don't need to." Elias waited, then asked, "Is he better than you?" Thomas did look up then, not with offense, not with pride, just thoughtfulness, and replied, "He's good, and I'm good, and the village is still standing." It wasn't about skill. It never really was. It was about weight, about reputation, about who people trusted with which things. Garin got the cheaper work sometimes, hinges, brackets, quick welds. Tomas got the horseshoes. The spears, the repairs that came with silence. Garin worked alone. No apprentice, no helper. Just him and the iron. That, more than anything, made him distant. Not unkind, just unreachable. But still, their paths crossed. At market, they'd pass one another near the flour cart. Garin would nod. Tomas would nod back. Nothing more, no warmth, no frost, just the quiet recognition of someone who knew what it meant to sweat beside flame. There was a kind of dignity in that, a kind of peace. Once, during winter, when Thomas's bellows split and the leather wouldn't hold, it was Garen who left an extra strap outside the forge door. No note, no knock, just leather, folded neatly, dusted with snow. Thomas used it without comment, never returned it, never spoke of it. But 2 weeks later, when a shipment of coal arrived, he set aside half a sack and left it leaning against Garen's fence. It was enough. They were not friends, but they understood each other. And that, sometimes, is stronger than friendship. Elias remained curious. He asked questions now and then. What tools did Garen use? Why didn't he take an apprentice? What kind of work did he prefer? Thomas answered as best he could. Not from gossip, from observation. He didn't speculate. He respected the silence too much. One late afternoon, as the sun bent low over the hills and the forge filled with orange light, Garen passed by the open doorway. He didn't enter, didn't pause, but he did glance inside, just for a second, just enough to see Elias holding the tongs, Tomas guiding his hand. Their eyes met, Tomas's and Garen's, and something passed between them. Not challenge, not envy, just recognition. Garen nodded. Tomas nodded back. That night, Elias said, "I think he's lonely." Tomas didn't answer right away. He sat by the hearth, oiling the handle of a tool, his hands steady, slow. Then he said, "We all are, in some way. The fire doesn't talk back." Elias looked down, thought for a long moment, then said, "But you let me talk." Tomas didn't look up, but his lips shifted just slightly. "Yes," he said, "I do." There was room in the village for 2 forges, just enough work, just enough need, just enough patience. They would never work side by side. They didn't need to. Fire doesn't need company. It only needs fuel. And both men had enough of that to keep their worlds alive. The salve of grandmother's herbs. It started with a blister, small and angry, tucked just beneath the thumb, where the hammer had caught the skin one too many times. Not deep, not bloody, just red and tender and sore in that quiet, persistent way that made every movement feel sharper than it should. Elias didn't complain. He never did. But Tom saw him favoring that hand when lifting the tongs, hesitating for half a second before gripping the handle, flinching when sweat ran across it. And so, without a word, Tomas set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his apron, and said, "We're going to see someone." Elias followed without question, though confusion danced behind his eyes. They didn't walk far, just past the edge of the square, through a narrow garden gate where lavender grew thick against the wall, and rosemary reached upward like green fingers toward the sky. The house behind it was small, older than the forge, with shutters painted blue and a wooden bench beneath the window that sagged slightly in the middle. Thomas knocked once, not loud. A pause. Then the door opened. She wasn't his grandmother, not by blood, but everyone called her that, Grandmother Else. Thin as a broomstick, wrapped in 3 layers of wool even in summer, her hair braided down her back like a rope of silver. Her hands spotted with age, but never still. her eyes sharp as needles, flicked from Tomas to Elias, to the blistered hand before either man could speak. She stepped aside, said only, "Sit." Inside, the house smelled of thyme and old parchment and something sweeter, honey maybe, or dried apple. And the walls were lined with jars, all shapes and sizes, filled with leaves, roots, powders, oils. A low fire crackled in the hearth. A cat watched from the windowsill, with one eye open and one closed. Elias sat where she pointed, on a low stool beside the fire. Tomas stood nearby, arms crossed, silent. Elsa took the boy's hand gently, turned it in hers, examined the blister without comment. Then she nodded once, stood, crossed to a shelf, and selected a small crock sealed with waxed cloth. She peeled it open with care and dipped 2 fingers inside. The salve was greenish, thick, and smelled of crushed pine and something deeper, like wet stone after rain. She dabbed it onto the skin in a slow circle, her touch firm but kind, and Elias let out a soft breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The sting faded instantly. In its place came coolness, and then warmth, not burning, but soothing, like sunlight on skin after shade. She said nothing as she wrapped the hand in clean linen, her fingers working fast, precise. When she was done, she tied the knot, patted the hand once, and stood. "It will heal," she said, "but only if he stops trying to prove something every time he picks up the hammer." Elias flushed. Tomas smiled, just a little. Else caught the look and added, "And only if the master remembers that boys are not made of iron." Tomas nodded once, his smile fading into thought. They stayed a moment longer. Else poured tea into 2 chipped mugs. Didn't ask if they wanted it, just placed them on the table. The tea was bitter, dark, but full of strange comfort. Elias drank it slowly, his hand resting gently in his lap, wrapped now in herb and cloth and care. Before they left, Elsa handed Thomas a new jar of the salve. "He'll need it again," she said. Thomas slipped it into his coat without argument. "I know," he said. "I did too." Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The wind carried the scent of turned soil, smoke, and the distant promise of rain. They walked back in silence, not out of discomfort, but because words would have broken the softness of the moment, the kind of quiet you don't want to disturb, the kind that lingers, like the warmth of the salve, long after the wound has faded. Back at the forge, Elias unwrapped the hand, applied more of the salve, and rewrapped it himself. Slower this time, with care. Thomas said nothing, just watched. The forge glowed beside them, but they didn't light the fire that night. Some wounds needed stillness more than flame, and in the air, faint and steady, the scent of pine and thyme remained. Village gossip. It started as most things did in the village, quietly, from the corner of a mouth over a bucket, or behind a loaf of bread at the market stall. Words dropped like crumbs in the dust, picked up by others without meaning to, carried along in the folds of aprons, in the baskets of vegetables, in the pockets of men on their way to the mill. Gossip didn't knock. It seeped. And once it seeped, it stayed. The forge was not exempt. If anything, It attracted stories the way iron drew lightning. Silently, powerfully, without asking. Tomas didn't chase rumors, didn't speak them, didn't ask. But he heard. Of course he did. You couldn't spend your days with your doors open and not overhear the names that fell like pebbles through the cracks in conversation. Sometimes he would catch a whisper while fixing a wheel hub about a daughter running off with the stable boy, or a merchant who watered his wine. Sometimes it was about the priest, or the baker's wait, or the stranger who stayed too long at the inn. Sometimes it was about him. Elias was the one who noticed it first, not in words, but in looks. The way people paused before speaking when Tomas approached. The way someone laughed too hard when he passed. The way children turned and whispered as he walked by, with a hammer in one hand and a pair of tongs in the other. He asked one evening, as they cleaned the tools by lantern light, "Do you care what they say?" Tomas didn't look up. "Depends on who's saying it," he answered, "and whether it's true." It wasn't all cruel. Most of it wasn't even meant to hurt. Gossip in the village was less about malice and more about rhythm, a way for people to fill space, to keep the silence away when they had no music, but words had weight, even when dropped in jest. Thomas knew that. He'd seen a man's life crumble from one misheard sentence, from one wrong name tied to the wrong night. You didn't need fire to burn someone, just enough breath behind a lie. Still, he let it be. The forge didn't argue. It didn't defend. It stood, open and hot and honest, and the work spoke louder than any whisper. He made shoes that held firm, tools that didn't break, hinges that didn't creak. That was enough. But Elias was younger, less willing to let things pass. He'd clench his jaw when he heard someone snicker. He'd mutter under his breath when a woman outside the window said something just loud enough to be heard. Tom's told him once, over lunch, "You can hammer steel for hours and it still bends. People are softer than that. You'll never shape their mouths." Elias nodded, but his eyes stayed hard. One afternoon, a customer arrived with a dented cooking pot and too many opinions. He said, as Tomas examined the dent, "Shame about the boy, though, working in a forge when he should be in the fields, or in church. That's where apprentices used to go, not crawling in the dust behind a man with no wife and no children." Elias froze. Tomas didn't. He tapped the edge of the pot with his finger, handed it back, and said, "It won't hold. Too far gone." The man left with a frown, no repair, and no further words. Later, when the door was shut and the fire low, Elias asked, "Is that what they think? That it's wrong for me to be here?" Toms didn't answer right away. He wiped down the tongs, set them in their place, and said quietly, "What they think changes nothing about what you've made with your hands." Elias was quiet after that, but the line stayed with him. Not all gossip was wrong. That was the strangest part. Some of it carried truth, just wrapped in exaggeration, like a nail driven too deep. Toms had once loved a woman who left. He had once turned away a customer who never forgave him. He had once shouted at the priest. All of that had happened, but not the way the village told it. The village forgot details. It remembered drama. That was its gift and its curse. Still, there were times when gossip did something useful. When the widow on the hill sent soup for Elias after someone mentioned he'd burned his hand. When the old stablemaster brought a new pair of gloves without being asked, just happened to pass by. When someone quietly left a bag of barley flour on the forge steps. No name, just care, hidden in silence. Sometimes, people who said too much also knew when to say nothing. Tomas taught Elias something then, without saying the words, that you listen to gossip the same way you listen to wind. You note its direction, feel its chill, and then you get back to work. Because the forge didn't care what people whispered. It only cared if the blade was straight, if the wheel turned, if the hinge didn't groan. And those things could not be lied into failure. A new sword commission. The man came just before dusk, tall, wrapped in a traveling cloak streaked with dust and rain, his boots worn but polished, the kind that had seen long roads and knew how to walk quietly. And when he stepped into the forge, he didn't look around, didn't comment on the heat or the smell or the way the light flickered on the stone walls. He simply stood near the anvil, hands clasped in front of him, waiting. Tomas noticed him from the corner of his eye, didn't speak right away, finished shaping the final bend of a bracket, wiped his palms on his apron, and only then turned to face him. "I need a sword," the man said, not demanding, not arrogant, just certain, like someone used to having his needs met without explanation. Tomas nodded once. "Do you want a soldier's blade or a gentleman's?" The man paused. "Something that holds both," he said. Thomas understood. He always did. There were men who needed swords for war, and men who wanted them for show. And once in a while, there was someone who needed both at once. Something honest and dangerous, beautiful and capable. They spoke little after that. The man unrolled a piece of parchment with a rough sketch. Dimensions, no flourishes, only what mattered. Length, weight, balance. A straight blade with a fuller down the center. A guard shaped like wings drawn back. A grip wrapped in dark leather, and no markings on the steel. No initials, no crest. Just a weapon meant to be silent. Tomas said, 2 weeks. The man nodded, set down a pouch heavy with coin, and left without looking back. Elias stood by the wall, wide-eyed, silent. When the door closed, he said, "A sword?" Thomas looked at him. "Yes," he said, "a new one." Elias stepped forward slowly. "You haven't made one since I came." Tomas didn't answer. He walked to the bench, cleared a space with slow hands, set the parchment down, and unfolded a roll of cloth containing his finest chisels, his finishing files, the things he only touched when the work called for more than strength. Forging a sword was not like forging a hinge or a horseshoe. It wasn't just about heat and hammer. It was about balance, memory, intention. A sword had to move like an extension of the arm, like thought, like breath. It couldn't simply cut. It had to speak. They began the next morning. The steel was chosen carefully. Bars set aside long ago for something that mattered. Tomas turned them in his hands, feeling the weight, sensing the promise within. He cut them to length, cleaned the surface, began the slow, deliberate process of layering. Folding, heating, folding again, until the grain of the metal ran true, like wood polished by time. Elias watched everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask. He handed tools when needed, kept the fire steady, adjusted the bellows until the coals glowed white with hunger. The forge changed in those days. It felt different, not louder, just more focused, like every sound carried intention. The anvil rang cleaner. The fire breathed deeper. On the third day, Thomas shaped the core, the spine of the sword. He struck with rhythm, always in threes, always turning the blade between blows, checking the taper, the line, the center. Sparks rose and fell like stars. But Thomas didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the metal. His body moved with it. When he quenched it, steam roared, rising to the ceiling in a great sigh. Elias stepped back, awe and fear mixing in his chest. That night, they didn't speak. Tomas cleaned the edge with a file so fine it sang when it scraped. Elias brewed tea without being told. They sat in silence, sipping warmth while the sword cooled on the rack beside them. Over the next days, the blade came alive. The edge was drawn slowly, kissed by the grindstone, polished in long strokes, the steel turning from dull to bright, from rough to smooth. Tomas worked without pause, every motion practiced, respectful. When the guard was fitted, cast in a mold he'd carved by hand years before, Elias held his breath. When the grip was wrapped, tight and dark and strong, Tomas used a piece of leather cut from an old riding bridle. "It's seen distance," he said. "That matters." They tested it quietly in the back lot, away from eyes. Tomas swung it once, then twice, letting it flow through the air. No flourish, no speed, just control. The blade hummed, a sound that only came from steel forged with truth. Elias finally asked, "Who is it for?" Thomas looked at the blade in his hand, then said, "Someone who will need it." He didn't say more. 2 weeks to the day, the man returned. He stepped inside, nodded once, said nothing. Tomas laid the sword across the bench, uncovered it slowly. The man stepped forward, lifted it, tested the weight, turned it in his hand, let the light catch the edge. No praise, no thanks, just a slow, silent nod. He placed a second pouch of coin beside the first and left. The forge was quiet again. Elias stood by the fire, watching the door. "You don't even know what he'll do with it," he said. Thomas picked up a rag, wiped his hands. "That's not my part," he said. "I made it to last. What he makes of it now is his story." And the forge, once again, waited for the next shape to come to life. A moment in the shade. The sun was high, and the heat pressed down like a weight. Not sharp, not violent, just steady and full. The kind of heat that doesn't burn, but wraps itself around the bones, reminding the body that it's been standing too long, lifting too much, breathing too many hours of smoke and steel. The forge was still glowing, though the fire had been banked, tucked down beneath ash to rest while Thomas drank. He didn't go far. Just outside the door, where the shadow of the wall stretched across the packed dirt, a sliver of cool, a thin breath of air, untouched by flame or hammer or sweat. He sat on the low bench beneath the eaves, elbows resting on his knees, cup in hand, Not cold, not full, but enough. The wood creaked beneath him, familiar, worn smooth by years of similar pauses, moments where the body stopped, even if the mind didn't. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to forget the shape of the blade he'd finished that morning, the ache in his shoulder that would not go, the long list of small repairs waiting on the shelf. Elias didn't speak when he joined him. He never did, not during these pauses. He just sat, a little apart, not out of distance, but respect, hands clasped, eyes on the ground or the sky or the way the sun painted lines along the dirt. They sat like that often now, in silence, between the hours, between the wait. The village hummed softly around them, chickens scratching near the bakery wall, a cartwheel creaking as it turned too fast on the corner, a baby crying 2 doors down, then quieted by a voice too soft to hear. Life moved, but slowly, like breath during sleep, steady and rhythmic, asking nothing of them for just a little while. A leaf drifted down from the roof above, landed on Tomas's boot. He didn't brush it away. He looked at it, yellow at the edge, tired. Summer was still strong, but the turn had begun. He felt it in the light, in the way the birds sang lower, in the way his hands stiffened a little earlier each morning. He said quietly, "I used to hate resting." Elias looked over, said nothing. Tomas sipped from the cup, wiped his mouth, continued, "Felt like wasted time. Felt like the fire was cooling while I wasn't watching." He chuckled, dry and short. "But the fire needs to cool, just a little, or it burns the steel." Elias nodded. He understood, or he was learning to. Shade like this didn't last long, not in the afternoon, not with the sun still rising past its peak. But while it stayed, it felt like a gift, a small corner of peace carved out between the anvils and the noise. It didn't fix anything. It didn't take away the pain in Tomas's back or the scabs on Elias's fingers, but it softened them just enough. Toms leaned back, let his shoulders touch the wall. He watched the sky through the break in the roofline, not blue, not white, just a haze of light, warm and endless. He remembered being young, remembered sitting in shade just like this, outside a different forge, knees bloodied, hands empty, watching his own master drink from a clay jug and not speak. He'd hated it then. The waiting, the stillness, wanted to move, to learn, to prove. Now he understood. Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet, not breaking the moment, but adding to it. Sometimes, when it's quiet like this, it feels like everything is still listening. The tools, the stone, the sky. Thomas turned to him, not surprised, just curious. Listening to what? Elias looked away, smiled faintly. To what we don't say. Thomas nodded. Maybe that's where the real forging happens. Neither of them moved for a long while. The cup grew lighter. The shadow grew shorter. The village continued its song. A door slammed. A dog barked. The baker laughed once, loudly, then stopped. But the bench beneath the eaves held them, and the shade stayed just long enough. When Thomas finally stood, his joints creaked. He stretched once, slowly, the sound of his spine loud in the quiet. Elias stood too, brushing dust from his trousers. No words, no rush. They turned together, stepped back into the forge, where the heat had dimmed, but not died. The hammer waited. The tongs waited, but so had they, and now they were ready again, working on the holy day. The bell rang early that morning, slow and deep, its sound floating over the rooftops like a low cloud, carried by still air and habit. And as it rang a second time, people stirred, not because they had forgotten the day, but because they couldn't. The holy day was not marked on paper. It was carved into the rhythm of the village, a pause built into the week, a silence wrapped in custom. Shops stayed shuttered. The square was swept, not sold upon. Bread was baked the day before. Doors creaked open only to let in light, not coin. And yet, the forge door stood ajar. Not wide, just enough. Enough for breath, enough for duty. Tomas stood by the hearth, sleeves rolled, hands already blackened. He didn't light the fire with speed. He didn't strike the hammer in anger. He worked like someone whispering instead of speaking, careful, respectful, steady. The forge breathed quietly. Not the roar of a weekday, just a slow hum, like a prayer that didn't need words. Elias arrived later than usual, unsure whether to come at all. He paused at the doorway, boots on the step, eyes flicking to the sky as if expecting judgment to fall like rain. "It's the holy day," he said softly. Thomas didn't look up. "So I'm told." He gestured toward the bench. A wheel pin lay waiting, cracked and splintered, the kind that could break a cart and a leg if ignored too long. "It's for old Mickle," Thomas added. "He needs to ride to the next village. His daughter's due. The priest can pray. I'll keep the axle from snapping." Elias stepped inside. They worked in near silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, just reverent. Outside, the bell rang again. Mid-morning. Somewhere, psalms were being sung. A child's voice rose in brief laughter, then vanished. The sound of shoes on gravel passed now and then, softer than usual, slower. No carts, no calls, just footsteps and thought. The fire never rose above a murmur. Thomas added just enough coal to keep the iron soft, not bright. No sparks flew. No steam hissed. It was forging at its gentlest, metal shaped more by patience than heat. Elias handed him the files without speaking. When the tongs slipped, he caught them before they fell, and Thomas nodded, not in praise, just in rhythm. They didn't speak of God, not here, not today. Tomas wasn't the kind to preach, but neither was he the kind to defy without cause. He believed in work that mattered, in care, in wait, in doing what needed doing, even when others knelt. He had knelt once, long ago, before the war, before the woman left, before the forge became his world. Since then, he had folded his hands only over steel. Elias watched him closely that day. Not for technique, for something else. Something he couldn't name. Something that felt like permission. Outside, the sun reached its peak. The village quieted further. Even the birds grew still. The heat held the air like hands around a bowl. Tom's wiped his brow, set the wheel pin in place, struck once, then twice. Soft, clean taps. He turned it, felt the grain. Done, he said. Not loudly, but with finality. They quenched the pin in silence. The steam curled upward, slow and white like incense. Afterwards, they didn't rush to clean. They sat instead, on the low stools, the fire dimming behind them. Thomas took a sip of water, passed the cup to Elias. Elias drank, said nothing. Then, quietly, Elias asked, "Do you think the priest would understand?" Thomas looked at the cooling fire. He might, or he might not, but the wheel won't ask what day it is when it shatters. Elias nodded. The sun slid down the western wall. Shadows stretched. The bell rang once more. Evening, this time. The village would stir again. People would walk slower, talk louder, open their doors to breeze and bread. But here, in the forge, the holy day had passed not in defiance, but in service. They cleaned the tools, folded the cloths, closed the door, and behind that closed door, they left no guilt. Only work done well, lanterns at the night market. The sun had slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky streaked in lavender and coal, and the first lanterns were already lit, swaying gently from ropes stretched between wooden poles and market stalls, their light golden and trembling, like stars that had drifted too low and decided to stay. The night market came only once a month, if the weather held, and tonight it did, windless, dry, just warm enough to wander without haste. Thomas didn't go often. He wasn't the kind to stroll without purpose, but Elias had asked quietly the way he always did when something mattered. And so for once, the forge cooled early. They walked side by side, Tomas with his hands behind his back, Elias with a coin in his pocket he hadn't decided to spend. The village square was different at night. Not louder, not even more alive, just softer. Sounds were muted by air thick with warmth and the hum of people talking in low voices. There were no carts crashing over cobbles, no hammers, no shouts. Only footsteps, laughter, the occasional clink of glass, the low rustle of fabric as people leaned in to look, to touch, to choose. The stalls glowed beneath canvas canopies. One sold roasted chestnuts, another sweet bread with honey, another candles shaped like birds and bells. A girl with braids played a flute near the well, her tune skipping lightly through the air like dust on a breeze. Thomas paused there a moment, not because of the music, because of the stillness it created around it. Elias wandered ahead, stopping at a man who carved spoons with a knife so thin it looked like silver. He picked one up, turned it in his hand, then set it down, not ready to spend the coin just yet. Thomas watched him without saying a word. There was joy in letting the boy move freely, watching him step through the crowd without fear, shoulders a little looser now than when he first arrived months ago. They walked on, past the bookseller's table, where the pages fluttered like moth wings in the breeze, past a woman selling dried herbs. Thomas paused there, picked up a bundle of rosemary and chamomile, not for healing, just for scent. He paid without a word. The woman smiled. She said, "For sleep?" He nodded. She added a sprig of lavender to the bundle. No charge. Her fingers were stained green at the nails, the kind of stains that never fully washed out. They walked further, past a boy turning glass beads over a flame, the fire reflected in his eyes, past a mother lifting her child to see the sky through the colored panes of a lantern, past a man carving something from soap, delicate, useless, beautiful. Tomas slowed there, watched the shapes appear. It reminded him of forging. Of course it did, but softer, quieter, without fire. Still, the discipline was the same. Hands steady, breath held, time folding in on itself. Elias tugged his sleeve gently. He held out 2 mugs, steam rising in delicate curls. Cider, warm, spiced with cloves and something darker. Thomas accepted it. They stood together by the edge of the market, near the shadow of the chapel, sipping slowly. The sweetness was soft, the heat gentle on the tongue. Neither of them spoke. The night air wrapped around them like a blanket, thick with the mingled scents of sugar and smoke, of oil and cinnamon, of earth cooling beneath the stars. Someone began to sing, not loudly, just one voice. An old song, without words, hummed from memory. It drifted through the market like mist, touching everyone and no one. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to be still. When he opened them, Elias was looking at a blade. It lay on a black cloth near the end of the row, short, curved, with a bone handle and no sheath. The man behind the table had a face like dried leather, fingers that twitched with age, but his eyes were sharp. Elias didn't reach for the blade. He looked at it the way one looks at something forgotten, and then suddenly remembered. Tomas stepped beside him, said nothing, just stood. After a moment, Elias asked, "Do you think I'll make one like that someday?" Tomas studied the blade, then the boy. "No," he said quietly. "You'll make something better, because it will be yours." They didn't buy the blade. They turned and walked back through the lanterns, past the woman with the herbs, the girl with the flute, the spoons, the carved soap, the flickering pages, the soft songs, and out into the quieter part of the night. The stars had come out by then. The sky, full and soft, leaned over the village like a roof of silver breath. Back at the forge, the coals had gone cold. The tools slept. Tomas hung the bundle of herbs near the window. Elias placed the coin back into its small wooden box. And somewhere, outside, the lanterns burned just a little longer, waiting for the next story to pass beneath them, icy breath in the winter air. The cold came suddenly, not with fanfare, not with storm or snow, but with a silence that settled on the village like a closing door. The wind changed first, sharper, thinner, as if the sky itself had grown tired and no longer wished to hold warmth. Then came the frost, thin lines across the windows, spidering like quiet warnings. Then the mornings where the buckets were crusted with ice, where breath curled out of mouths in white ribbons, and boots struck the ground with hard, flat sounds. The forge, once a place of sweat and fire, now became a kind of refuge, its heat not just practical, but sacred. Tomas arrived earlier, not to begin work, just to stoke the coals before the cold could settle into the walls. The fire took longer to wake now. It needed coaxing. The wood cracked more sharply. The bellows wheezed as if tired. But eventually, warmth would return. Soft, orange, faithful. and Thomas would hold his hands over the embers for a moment before beginning. Elias came later than usual that first icy morning, not because of laziness, because his boots had split. He'd tried to patch them with thread, but the leather had stiffened overnight. When he arrived, his cheeks were red, his breath coming in short bursts, and his fingers barely moved as he tried to lace the apron. Tom said nothing, just handed him a cloth and gestured toward the fire. They didn't work right away. They stood, warming hands, letting the heat chase the stiffness from joints and breath. Outside, the frost clung to everything: stone, iron, wood. Even the air had weight now. The sound of a hammer felt louder in the cold, like each strike cracked not just metal, but silence itself. The first job of the day was a broken hinge from the church door. The iron had snapped, brittle from years of use and a sudden freeze. Thomas held the pieces in his hand, turned them, frowned. "Too thin," he said. "Should have been replaced years ago." Elias nodded. "They'll want it back by Sunday." Tomas gave a soft grunt. "Of course they will." They worked slowly, not from laziness, because the metal cooled faster now. It needed to be returned to the flame more often, watched more closely. Even the tools were colder, less forgiving. Every movement had to be deliberate. No wasted effort, no haste. The fire was steady, but the air stole its warmth the moment it left the hearth. Thomas wore gloves now, not for protection, but for preservation. Elias, too, though his were thinner, worn at the fingers. Midday brought no sun, only gray light, flat and unmoving, like a sky that had forgotten how to change. Tom's poured tea, warm and bitter, and handed Elias a cup. They drank beside the fire, shoulders close, steam rising together in quiet curls. Tomas finally said, "Winter makes everything slower." Elias looked at him. "Even people?" Tomas nodded. "Especially people, but it also makes what you do matter more." Elias looked into his cup. "Because it's harder? Because it's needed," Tomas replied. That afternoon, a traveler came, wrapped in layers of wool and impatience. His horse had thrown a shoe somewhere on the road, and the beast stood now in the yard, breath like fog, hoof cracked. "Can you fix it before dusk?" the man asked, stamping his feet. Tomas didn't look up from the bench. "We can fix it, but the horse will wait longer than you think." The man grumbled, muttered about lost time, about missed crossings, about how no one in the north moved with urgency. Thomas didn't reply. He just reached for the rasp, tested the old shoe, and began again. Elias helped, hands numb, sleeves soaked from melted frost. But the work warmed them, slowly. In the rhythm of striking and adjusting, their breath returned. By the time the horse left, fitted, quiet, the man had said nothing more. Just nodded once, tossed a coin, and disappeared into the falling dark. That evening, they didn't speak much. Thomas sat with a cloth across his knees, polishing an old blade they'd found behind the bench, one dulled long ago and left forgotten. Elias sat nearby, trying to dry his gloves by the edge of the forge. The fire was low, the light warm, and outside, the frost thickened, slow and silent. Elias asked, "Does the cold ever stop feeling cold?" Thomas smiled, not with his mouth, but with his eyes. No, but you learn how to carry it. Elias nodded, and they listened for a long while to the sound of the wind threading through the village, like fingers through the strings of an old harp, distant and soft. Inside, the forge glowed, and their breath still rose like smoke. The iron speaks back. There came a day, late in winter, when the snow hadn't yet fallen, but the sky already carried its weight, and the forge felt heavier somehow, not colder, not darker, just slower, like it too was waiting. Thomas stood at the bench, with a blade half-shaped before him, one he had started without commission, without reason, simply because the steel had asked to be touched again. Some days were like that. Not about the work on the list, about something else, something older. Elias entered quietly, boots brushing snowmelt from the stone step, and saw the blade on the bench. It gleamed faintly under the oil lamp, not polished, not yet edged, but shaped enough to be something. "Who's it for?" he asked. Tomas didn't answer immediately. He turned the blade in his hand, looked at the curve, at the way the light slid across its surface. Then he said, "No one." Elias frowned. "Then why?" Tomas placed the blade down. "Because sometimes the iron speaks first." Elias didn't understand, not fully, but he didn't question further, not yet. That day, the fire was slower to wake. It coughed smoke before catching. Tomas stood over it with the bellows, working in a steady rhythm, not impatient, just focused. He didn't speak again until the coals glowed clean and the heat rose like breath through the ceiling. Only then did he lift the blade again and begin. There was something different about how he worked. He wasn't moving faster, but there was tension in his arm, not from strain, from attention. Every strike of the hammer was precise, like punctuation. The sound echoed differently too, not just loud, but resonant, as if the iron were answering, shaping itself with each blow, resisting and yielding in turns. Elias watched closely, not just with his eyes, with his ears, with his breath. He could feel it, the way the air shifted slightly with each strike, the way the fire seemed to lean forward, the way even the anvil held its silence a little longer before releasing the sound. After a while, Tomas paused, turned to him and said, "You hear it, don't you?" Elias didn't pretend. "Something," he said. Tomas nodded. "That's it. That's when you know it's real." Iron was never truly silent. Not if you were listening. It hissed in the fire. It rang under the hammer. It groaned in the quench. It whispered when filed. And sometimes it said something else, not in sound, but in feel, like it remembered what it once was and what it wanted to be again. They didn't speak for the rest of the morning. Thomas worked. Elias tended the fire, watched the colors shift from red to yellow to white, watched the blade change as well, from soft to hard, from dull to dangerous. By mid-afternoon, the edge was taking form. Thomas paused, wiped his brow, placed the blade carefully on the cloth, and sat. Elias sat beside him, waiting. Tomas picked up the old sharpening stone, the one his master had once given him, and began to draw the edge across it in slow, sweeping strokes. The sound was different from filing. It was quieter, more intimate, like breathing against a window. He said softly, "The first time I really heard the iron, I was your age. I was trying to make a simple hook, bent it too sharp, snapped it, started again, snapped it again, thought I was cursed. But the third time, I slowed down, watched the grain, felt the steel resist, and just before it bent, I felt it hesitate, like it was waiting for me to understand. And that's when I did. I wasn't shaping it, not really. I was speaking to it, and it was speaking back." Elias listened without interrupting. Thomas placed the finished blade down. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The kind of blade that could last a life, if respected. Not fancy, not decorative, but alive in the way all good tools are. Later, as dusk fell and the sky turned the color of coal dust, Thomas handed Elias a small piece of steel, flat, unmarked. "Try," he said, "but don't rush. Wait until it talks to you." Elias held the piece in his palm, cold, heavy, waiting, and for the first time, he listened, the stranger in the snow. The snow began in the early hours, soft at first, barely more than dust floating through the morning light. But by mid-morning, it had thickened, falling in slow sheets that blurred the rooftops and softened every sound. The forge was quieter that day. The fire burned steady, but no one came. No carts, no orders. Only silence, and the steady rhythm of steel meeting stone as Thomas sharpened an old plow blade, letting the hours slip past without counting them. Then the knock came. Not sharp, just 3 slow taps. Enough to be heard, not enough to be urgent. Thomas paused, set down the blade, wiped his hands. He opened the door. A man stood there, covered in snow, like he'd stepped out of the forest itself. Cloak heavy, boots caked white, face half hidden beneath a wool scarf. His eyes, though, were clear, pale, not blue, not gray. Something in between. He looked tired, but not weak. Weathered, but not lost. "I need warmth," he said simply. Not a plea. Not a command, just a truth. Thomas stepped aside. Inside, the man stood near the fire without removing his cloak. He held his hands out, not too close, letting the heat seep into him slowly. Thomas didn't ask questions. He knew better. Some men arrived with stories ready. Others waited until the silence wore thin. This man was the second kind. Elias appeared from the back, eyes wide, slowing when he saw the stranger. Thomas gave him a nod, not to leave, not to speak, just to wait. Elias stayed near the bench, watching. The man finally spoke. "You are the blacksmith." Thomas nodded. "I am." The man reached into his cloak and withdrew a bundle, wrapped in leather and tied with cord. He placed it on the work table, slowly, as if it were fragile. Thomas untied the knot, unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a sword, old, beautiful, broken. The blade had snapped clean just below the midline, the edge dulled, the grip worn to the bone. But it was well made. The kind of weapon crafted not for glory, but for survival. The kind someone had once trusted with their life. Thomas ran his fingers along the steel. What happened to it? The man was silent for a moment, then said, I outlived it. Tomas looked up. The man's face was still mostly hidden, but his eyes gave nothing away. You want it repaired? No, I want it buried, but not as it is. Tomas frowned. You want me to finish it first? I want you to make it whole, just long enough to say goodbye. Tomas understood then. Some blades were not tools. They were memory. They held not just blood, but names. He nodded. The man sat on the stool by the hearth, removed his cloak at last, revealing shoulders marked by scars and years. A soldier, or something like one. Not young, not old, just the kind of man who had walked through too many winters without leaving all of them behind. Tomas began the work. He cleaned the blade first, removing rust with cloth and oil, lifting the years gently, layer by layer. He held the broken pieces together, measured the line, decided where to weld. It wouldn't be perfect. The break would always be there, just beneath the finish. But that wasn't the point. Elias handed him the tongs, quietly, carefully. Together, they heated the forge, brought the broken metal back to orange, then white. Thomas held the pieces steady, fused them not with haste, but with the kind of care one reserves for bones that must hold weight again, even just for a while. Outside, the snow thickened. The village was quiet. Inside, the iron glowed. When the blade was shaped, welded, cooled, and finally polished, Thomas laid it down on black cloth. The line of the break still visible, faint like a healed scar. The man stood, stepped forward, picked up the sword, held it with both hands. He didn't swing it, didn't test the edge. He simply looked at it, then closed his eyes, and for a long moment, no one moved. When he opened them again, he placed the sword back down, folded the cloth over it. Thank you, he said. Will you bury it here? Tomas asked. The man shook his head. No, I'll take it to the river, to the place we made our last stand. Thomas didn't ask who he meant. The man tied the bundle once more, placed it beneath his arm, and pulled the cloak around his shoulders. He turned to Elias, gave a slight nod, and said, Listen to the fire. It speaks more truth than most men. Then he left. His footsteps vanished quickly in the snow. By evening, the forge was quiet again, but Thomas kept the fire going just a little longer than usual. And Elias stood by the window, staring into the white, fire without flame. The forge was dark, not because it was broken or forgotten or abandoned, but because Tomasis hadn't lit the fire. Not that day. Not even as the sky lightened outside, casting pale gray light through the open slats. The tools sat where they always did. The apron hung by the door. The coals waited, silent in their bed of ash. But the hearth remained cold. Elias stood by the door, uncertain, having arrived early, as always, ready to sweep, to sort, to feed the flame. But Tomas was already there, sitting on the bench near the back wall, hands resting on his knees, eyes not closed, but far away. The kind of stillness that asks not to be broken, the kind of silence shaped by memory. Elias didn't speak. He set down his satchel quietly, moved carefully, as if even the sound of his boots might shatter something delicate. He looked at the unlit hearth, then at Tomas, then back again. After a while, Tomas finally spoke. Sometimes, he said softly, you need to let the fire rest. Elias nodded, even though he didn't quite understand yet. It's not just about the heat, Tomas continued, voice low, words falling like embers. It's about what the fire does to you, to the steel, to time. He picked up a small piece of iron from the bench, turned it in his fingers. Cold, harmless. You keep it burning too long, it takes more than it gives. Elias walked slowly toward the hearth, stared down at the cold ash. It feels wrong, he whispered. The quiet. Tomas nodded. That's how you know you're listening. They sat together in the still forge, the air unmoving, the walls holding their breath. Outside, the world moved, barely. A bird chirped once. A cart creaked somewhere on the far side of the square. Someone laughed faintly in the distance, then stopped. But inside, it was just space, unfilled, unheated, waiting. Thomas reached for a cloth, began to polish a file. Slow circles, not for need, just for rhythm. Elias watched, then picked up a dull rasp and joined him. They worked in silence, cleaning tools that didn't need cleaning, passing time that didn't demand anything of them. It wasn't about getting something done. It was about not forcing something to begin. The forge had seen days like this before. Thomas remembered them. The day his father died, the day the war ended, the day no one came at all, days when the fire had nothing more to give, when the only way forward was to let it sleep. Do you miss it? Elias asked suddenly. The flame? Thomas didn't answer right away. He finished polishing the handle of the hammer, placed it down, then looked at Elias. Sometimes, but not always, there's a fire that burns even when the forge is cold. Elias tilted his head. What kind? Thomas pointed gently at his chest. The one that keeps going, even when everything else slows. For a while, neither of them moved. Then Thomas said, "Close your eyes." Elias hesitated, then obeyed. What do you hear? Elias listened. The ticking of the wall clock, the soft creak of the beam overhead, the faintest shift of wind through the shutters. My breath, he whispered. Yours. Now, Thomas said, what do you feel? Elias paused. The cold, he said, on my hands, my neck. And beneath it? Elias paused longer this time. A kind of warmth, very deep. Thomas smiled. That's the fire, the one that stays, even without flame. They opened their eyes. The forge still lay in shadow, but it no longer felt empty. The tools were there. The workbench, the anvil, and something else now, something steady. Thomas rose, joints creaking softly. He didn't go to the hearth. He walked to the door, opened it slowly. The light was still pale. Not full morning, not yet, but enough to see by. He stepped aside. Elias followed. Outside, the world was still waking. Snow was melting in thin rivulets along the gutters. A blackbird hopped across the path. The sky remained low and quiet, but no longer heavy. Tomas turned to Elias. Let's walk, he said. Where? Nowhere, Tomas answered. We'll know when we get there. And they walked, leaving the forge behind, letting it rest, letting it breathe. Because sometimes the truest fire burns when no one is watching. What remains when the hammer stops? The forge was quiet, not in the way it is when sleep settles over warm coals. or when work pauses for a midday cup, but in the way that silence sounds when something has ended, when breath is held not in hesitation, but in reverence. The fire had gone cold by choice. The tools were polished and hung. The anvil, so long the center of rhythm and weight, sat still and unwatched, not forgotten, but acknowledged, like an old friend at the edge of a conversation. Thomas stood in the doorway, his hands relaxed, not clenched, his eyes soft but alert, staring out across the yard, where a low wind carried the last leaves of autumn across dry stone. Behind him, Elias swept slowly, the motion meditative, not driven by dust, but by habit, by comfort, by the need to keep moving while the thoughts settled around him like soot. It had been a long season, long in the way a life can feel long when every day has mattered, not because of great events, but because of all the small ones. Each hinge mended, each blade balanced, each lesson repeated without haste. Elias no longer asked for instructions. He moved like someone who had memorized the answers not with his mind, but with his muscles. He lit the fire when it was needed, banked it when it burned too hot, listened not just to Tomas, but to the metal, the bellows, the wind. He had learned where to place his feet, how to hold the file with softness instead of force, how to read the color of steel like it was a language. And Tomas, for all his gruffness, had stopped correcting. Not because he had stopped caring, but because there was less left to say. Earlier that morning, Thomas had handed Elias the hammer, not the lightweight apprentice's hammer, but his own, the heavy one, the one with the worn grip, the one that had shaped doors, shoes, tools, even swords over decades. He hadn't said much, only, "Hold it," and Elias had. Not swinging, not testing, just holding it in the stillness, feeling its weight not just in his palm, but in his chest. Thomas had watched him. Then, with the gentlest breath of a voice that rarely softened, said, "There will come a day when your hand stops lifting it, when your back says enough, when your breath will slow, and the tools won't call as loudly. And when that day comes, you'll wonder what's left behind, what remains when the hammer stops." Elias hadn't replied. He'd only nodded, his grip tightening slightly, then relaxing. Now, the day was nearly done. The sun dipped low beyond the hills. The forge door stood open, letting in the light without resistance. Tomas stepped out, sat on the bench beside the door, the same bench where he had once sat alone, and now never did. Elias joined him without being asked, settling beside him with a soft exhale that carried more than fatigue. It carried understanding. The sky above them had turned the color of iron cooling underwater, soft gray streaked with the last gold of day. The village moved slowly around them. Someone was bringing in laundry. A child called out, then giggled. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Life was present, but distant, like a song heard from behind a door. They said nothing at first, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence was so full, so patient, so generous. After a while, Elias looked at his hands, rubbed his thumb across his palm, then asked quietly, "What do you think stays? I mean, really stays after the hammer's gone quiet?" He didn't look up as he spoke, not because he was shy, but because the question wasn't pointed. It was open, tender, a space offered. Tomas turned his head slightly. His breath fogged the air just a little. Then he answered, not fast, not slow, but carefully. The work stays, he said, and then paused. Not the iron. That rusts. Not the blades. They break or vanish or become something else. But the work, the knowledge in your hands, the rhythm in your step, the way you know when to strike and when to wait, that stays. He looked down at his knees. And sometimes the sound of your own hammer, even after it stopped ringing, still echoes in the arms of someone else. Elias nodded. He looked at his boots, then the floor, then the sky. So it's not the fire that matters. Tomas smiled, barely. It matters, but not forever. A forge is a mouth that speaks only while it's fed. A person carries more than flame. You carry the knowing, and that's enough. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the stone yard. A crow landed on the fence post, cawed once, then flew off again. Thomas leaned back against the wall, closed his eyes. Elias watched him, not with concern, but with care. He didn't know how long Tomas would keep working. Maybe another month. Maybe until spring. Maybe no more than tomorrow. But he understood something now, something he had only guessed at before. That even if Tomas left the forge behind, it wouldn't leave him. It wouldn't leave Elias either. Not really. He looked through the open door at the tools on the wall, the ones Tomas had carved his initials into decades ago. The same tools Elias had learned to lift, to respect, to trust. He saw the fire pit, black now, resting. He saw the anvil, still, waiting. He whispered, more to himself than to Tomas, "You taught me how to build things, but you also taught me how to wait." Thomas opened his eyes, turned his head slowly, and said, "That's the hardest part." And they sat together, not master and apprentice anymore, just two people shaped by the same flame. The air grew colder. They stood eventually, not because they were done, but because the day was. Thomas stepped back into the forge, picked up his apron one last time, folded it, placed it gently on the bench. Then he turned, took a long breath, and walked toward the door. Elias followed. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't need to. Some endings don't require a road. Outside, the sky turned ink dark. A single star appeared. Thomas didn't stop walking. Elias kept pace. And behind them, the forge stood still, not silent, just full of everything they'd left behind. And far above, in the cold air, the echo of the last hammer blow drifted outward, not fading, but folding into time.